What I'm about to share with you completely shattered everything I thought I understood about the boundaries between heaven and earth, about the mysterious ways God chooses to speak through the most innocent souls, and about how a teenage boy who died almost 2 decades ago continues to reach across the veil of eternity to touch lives in ways that defy every rational explanation. This happened in our small apartment in Rome during the winter of 2022, when my 6-year-old nephew Matteo, who had never spoken a complete sentence in his entire life and who lived locked in the silent fortress of severe autism, suddenly began creating portraits of religious figures with a precision that left neurologists, art experts, and theologians equally baffled, drawing people he had never seen with details he could not possibly have known. Before I dive into this testimony that has fundamentally transformed not just my family, but my entire understanding of faith, disability, and divine communication, I'd love to know, where are you watching this from right now? Do you have someone in your life with special needs? Or have you ever witnessed something that seemed to reach beyond the boundaries of what we consider possible? Drop a comment below telling me where you're joining me from, because this story needs to reach families who might be missing the miracles happening right in front of them. And if something deep in your spirit is telling you that what you're about to hear could change how you see the world, hit that subscribe button right now, because what comes next might open your eyes to signs and wonders that surround us every single day. My name is Alessandro Romano. I'm 34 years old. I work as a software engineer here in Rome, and I'm the uncle of Matteo, an extraordinary little boy who was diagnosed with severe nonverbal autism when he was 2.5 years old. The doctors told my sister Julia and her husband Marco that Matteo would likely never develop meaningful language, that he would struggle with basic social connections for his entire life, and that they should prepare themselves for a journey filled with challenges that would test every limit of their patience, resources, and hope. For 4 years, that prediction seemed devastatingly accurate. Matteo lived in what appeared to be a completely separate reality, communicating only through occasional gestures, responding to changes in routine with meltdowns that could last for hours, and spending most of his time engaged in repetitive behaviors that seemed to serve no purpose we could understand. I had always been close to my sister, and when Matteo was born, I had imagined being the cool uncle who would teach him about computers, take him to soccer games, and share all the things I loved. Instead, I found myself learning about therapy schedules, sensory processing disorders, and the heartbreaking reality of watching a child who seemed unreachable, no matter how much love you poured toward him. Matteo would sit for hours arranging his toy cars in perfectly straight lines, never looking up when we called his name, never showing interest in the games other children played, never giving us that basic human connection of eye contact that we all take for granted until it's absent. My family wasn't particularly religious at that time. We were culturally Catholic in the way many Italian families are: baptisms, first communions, Christmas and Easter Mass. But our faith was more tradition than conviction, more habit than genuine relationship with God. My sister and her husband were too exhausted from the daily struggles of caring for Matteo to think much about spiritual matters. And I had drifted into a comfortable agnosticism that let me avoid difficult questions about why a loving God would allow an innocent child to suffer the isolation of autism. Everything changed on a freezing December morning when I stopped by my sister's apartment to drop off some groceries. I let myself in with my key, expecting the usual scene of Matteo engaged in his repetitive activities, while Julia tried to manage household tasks around his rigid routines. Instead, I found something that stopped me cold in the doorway. Matteo was sitting at the kitchen table, completely absorbed in drawing with a set of colored pencils that had been a forgotten gift from months earlier. Pencils he had previously refused to touch because the texture bothered his sensitive hands. But it wasn't just that he was drawing, it was what he was creating. As I moved closer, barely breathing because I didn't want to startle him and break whatever spell had enabled this unprecedented behavior. I could see that Matteo was drawing a portrait of a woman with a level of technical skill that seemed absolutely impossible for a 6-year-old child, especially one who had never shown the slightest interest in art or any ability to hold a pencil properly. The proportions were perfect, the shading was sophisticated, and most astonishing of all, the expression on the woman's face conveyed a depth of maternal love and spiritual serenity that seemed to radiate off the paper. "Matteo," I whispered, kneeling beside him but careful not to touch him or invade his space in ways that usually triggered his distress. "That's beautiful. Who is she?" I didn't expect an answer. Matteo had never responded to direct questions in his life. So what happened next literally made my hands start shaking. Without looking up from his work, without any hesitation or struggle, Matteo spoke in a clear, calm voice that sounded like he'd been talking fluently his entire life. "Mary. She told me to draw her. She said you need to see." I actually stumbled backward, my mind unable to process what I'd just heard. Matteo had spoken. Not just a single word, not just an echolalic repetition of something he'd heard, but a complete, contextually appropriate sentence with information I had never taught him. My sister appeared from the bedroom, drawn by the sound of my reaction, and when I pointed at Matteo with a trembling finger, unable to form words, she saw what he was creating, and her face went absolutely white. Over the next several hours, while Julia and I sat frozen in stunned silence, Matteo continued working on the portrait with an intensity and focus that was completely unlike his usual scattered attention. He added intricate details to the woman's veil, capturing the way light would fall on fabric with a painter's understanding of shadow and reflection. He drew her hands in a position of prayer with anatomical accuracy that would have been impressive from an art student. When he finally set down the pencil, we were looking at a portrait of the Virgin Mary that was so technically accomplished and spiritually moving that it could have hung in a church. That evening, after Matteo had gone to bed, with no apparent awareness that anything unusual had happened, Julia and I sat at that kitchen table staring at the drawing, trying to find some rational explanation for what we'd witnessed. My sister's hands were still shaking as she touched the edges of the paper. "Alessandro," she whispered, "he's never drawn anything before. He won't even hold crayons because he hates how they feel. And he spoke. Did you hear him speak? Where did this come from?" I had no answers. My software engineer's brain, trained to solve problems through logic and systematic analysis, had absolutely no framework for processing what we just experienced. But as I looked at that portrait of Mary, at the impossible skill and spiritual depth captured by a 6-year-old boy with severe autism who had never been taught about art or religion, I felt something shift deep inside my chest. The first crack in the wall of skepticism I'd built around anything that couldn't be measured or explained. That night marked the beginning of a journey that would lead our family into mysteries I never believed existed, that would connect us across time and death to a teenage boy named Carlo Acutis, who died before Matteo was even born, and that would ultimately transform my understanding of disability, holiness, and the ways heaven reaches into our everyday lives through the most unexpected channels. The morning after Matteo's first drawing, I arrived at my sister's apartment before work, unable to stop thinking about what I'd witnessed. I found Matteo already awake, sitting in the same spot at the kitchen table, but this time he was working on a second portrait. My breath caught when I saw what he was creating. A teenage boy, maybe 14 or 15 years old, dressed in casual modern clothes, jeans, sneakers, a simple polo shirt, but with an expression of joy and wisdom that seemed far too profound for someone so young. The technical quality was even better than the first drawing, as if Matteo's skills were improving exponentially with each piece. "Matteo," I said softly, pulling up a chair beside him. "Who is this boy you're drawing?" This time I was half expecting a response, but I was still completely unprepared for what came next. Matteo set down his pencil, turned to look directly into my eyes, establishing eye contact for the first time in his life that I could remember, and said with perfect clarity, "Carlo, he's my friend. He teaches me things at night when I sleep. He said you used to pray when you were little, but you stopped because you got angry at God. He wants you to know God never stopped listening." The room started spinning. I grabbed the edge of the table to steady myself, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Matteo had just revealed something I had never told anyone in my family, something buried so deep in my past that I'd almost convinced myself I'd forgotten it. When I was 12 years old, my best friend Luca had died in a car accident, and I had prayed desperately for weeks afterward, begging God to bring him back, to explain why, to give me some sign that any of it meant something. When no answers came, I had made a conscious decision to stop praying, to stop believing in a God who would take my friend and leave me alone with my grief. That was 22 years ago, and I had never spoken about it to anyone. "How do you know that?" I managed to whisper, but Matteo had already returned to his drawing, adding final details to the boy's hands, which he was depicting holding what looked like a laptop computer. The incongruity of seeing a religious portrait that included modern technology struck me as strange, but everything about this situation was already so far beyond normal that I just watched in silence as my nephew worked. When the portrait was finished, I carefully took a photo of it with my phone, my hands still trembling slightly. Something was nagging at the back of my mind, a sense that the face Matteo had drawn looked vaguely familiar, though I couldn't place where I might have seen it. That afternoon, during my lunch break at work, I did something I never thought I'd do. I started searching online for information about religious figures who might match the description of the boy in Matteo's drawing: young, casual clothing, associated with computers. What I found made me literally drop my phone. The blessed Carlo Acutis, a teenage boy who had died of leukemia in 2006 at age 15, who had been beatified in 2020, who was known for his computer skills and for creating websites about Eucharistic miracles. I pulled up image after image of Carlo, and there was absolutely no question. Matteo had drawn an exact portrait of this boy, capturing not just his physical features, but something essential about his personality, that characteristic smile that appeared in almost every photo, the combination of normal teenage energy and profound spiritual depth. But this was impossible. My sister's family wasn't religious enough to know about recently beatified teenagers. We didn't have religious books or images in the house. Matteo had never been exposed to any teaching about Carlo Acutis. I was certain of that. And yet he had drawn him with perfect accuracy and had called him by name, claimed to talk with him at night, and had somehow known the most painful secret from my childhood. I drove back to Giulia's apartment that evening, bringing printouts of photos of Carlo Acutis that I'd found online. When I showed them to my sister, comparing them to Matteo's drawing, she actually started crying. "This isn't possible," she kept repeating. "Alessandro, this isn't possible." Where would he have seen this boy? How could he know these things? Over the next week, Matteo created a series of drawings that left us increasingly convinced we were witnessing something that transcended normal explanation. He drew St. Francis of Assisi with his characteristic pose and expression, identifying him by name even though we'd never taught him about saints. He created a portrait of St. Padre Pio that included specific details like the fingerless gloves he wore to cover his stigmata, details Matteo couldn't possibly have known. Each drawing came with brief comments from Matteo, spoken in that same clear, calm voice that contrasted so sharply with his usual nonverbal state. What made these drawings even more extraordinary was how they contrasted with Matteo's other behaviors. He was still clearly autistic. He still struggled with changes in routine, still engaged in his repetitive behaviors, still had most of the challenges that had defined his condition since diagnosis. But when it came to drawing these specific religious figures, it was as if a completely different aspect of his consciousness took over, one that had access to information and abilities that existed nowhere else in his functioning. My sister and I began documenting everything meticulously. We photographed each drawing with timestamps, recorded the exact words Matteo spoke while creating them, and noted any details that we later verified as historically accurate. I created a spreadsheet tracking correlations between what Matteo drew and said versus verified historical information, and the accuracy rate was approaching 100%. My engineer's mind still wanted a rational explanation, but the data was pointing towards something that my materialist worldview couldn't accommodate. It was during this period that Matteo created what would become the most significant drawing of all. One evening, he produced a portrait showing two figures together, the Virgin Mary and Carlo Acutis, both looking directly out of the page with expressions of love and invitation. But what made this drawing different was the additional element Matteo included. He had drawn himself, a small figure standing between them holding their hands, with rays of light emanating from all three figures toward a fourth figure that he drew in the corner. A figure that, when I looked closely, I realized was meant to be me. "Carlo said to show you this," Matteo told me when he finished the drawing. "He said you think you're too broken to pray anymore, but that's when God listens the most. He said your friend Luca wants you to stop being angry and start remembering the good things instead. And he said, you're going to help other people understand about special kids like me, but first you have to stop being afraid of believing in things you can't put in a computer." I don't know how long I stood there staring at that drawing, tears running down my face for the first time in years. Everything Matteo had said cut straight through every defense I'd built, every rationalization I'd constructed, every wall I'd erected between myself and the possibility of faith. This 6-year-old boy who had never been able to communicate before was delivering messages that addressed the deepest wounds of my soul, messages that came through a teenage saint I'd never heard of until a week ago, and it was all happening through artwork that defied every explanation my educated, skeptical mind could generate. That night, alone in my apartment, I did something I hadn't done in 22 years. I prayed. It wasn't eloquent or sophisticated. I barely remembered how. But I spoke into the darkness, asking if anyone was really there, if any of this was real, if God actually cared about a burned-out software engineer who'd spent 2 decades running from anything that looked like faith. And I asked Carlo Acutis, this boy I just learned existed, to help me understand what was happening to my nephew and what it all meant. If you're still with me, if this story is resonating with something in your own experience, maybe you've seen unexplainable moments of grace, or maybe you're struggling to believe in anything beyond what you can see and measure, I want you to do something right now. Hit that subscribe button, because what comes next in this journey goes even deeper into mysteries that will challenge everything you think you know about disability, holiness, and how heaven intersects with earth. And drop a comment telling me, have you ever experienced something that couldn't be explained by logic alone? Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to recognize the miracles in their own life. The weeks following my tentative return to prayer brought changes that rippled through our entire family in ways I'm still trying to fully understand. Matteo's drawings became more frequent and increasingly specific. But what was even more remarkable was the transformation in his overall demeanor and capabilities. The boy who had spent 4 years locked in isolation began initiating interactions with family members, not in typical ways, but in his own unique fashion that seemed to bridge the gap between his autistic experience of the world and our neurotypical expectations. He would approach my sister or her husband and simply place a hand on their arm, standing quietly for a moment before returning to his activities. These brief touches, so simple yet so monumental given his previous avoidance of physical contact, brought Julia to tears more than once. "It's like he's checking on us," she told me one evening. "Like he's making sure we're okay in his own way." The doctors who had predicted lifelong severe impairment were baffled by the changes they were observing in Mateo's developmental assessments. But the drawings remained the most dramatic manifestation of whatever was happening to my nephew. What particularly struck me as I continued documenting them was the pattern of messages they contained. Each portrait came with specific information that Mateo would share, sometimes while drawing, sometimes after completing the work. And these messages almost always addressed something specific happening in the life of whoever was present when he created the piece. One afternoon, I brought my colleague Sophia to meet Mateo. Sophia was going through a devastating divorce and was struggling with whether to maintain her faith in God after her marriage had fallen apart, despite years of prayer. I hadn't told Mateo anything about Sophia. I'd simply mentioned I was bringing a friend to visit. Within minutes of meeting her, Mateo had begun drawing a portrait of Saint Monica, the mother of Saint Augustine who had prayed for decades for her son's conversion. When he finished, Mateo handed the drawing to Sophia and said, "Carlo says Monica prayed for 30 years before her prayers were answered, and she never stopped believing even when it looked like nothing was changing. He says your prayers aren't being ignored. They're being stored up like seeds that will grow when the time is right. And he says the ending of your marriage isn't the ending of your story." Sophia, who had never been particularly religious and who didn't even know who Saint Monica was, broke down crying right there in my sister's kitchen, later telling me that those words had given her the first real hope she'd felt in months. During this period, I started researching Carlo Acutis intensively, reading everything I could find about his life, his passion for the Eucharist, his computer skills, and the miracles attributed to his intercession. The more I learned, the more I felt a strange connection to this boy who had died 16 years before Mateo was born. Carlo had been passionate about using technology to spread faith, creating websites and exhibitions about Eucharistic miracles. And here I was, a software engineer who had abandoned faith, being drawn back through the impossible technological precision of my nephew's divinely inspired artwork. I discovered that Carlo had said, "We are all born as originals, but many die as photocopies," and that he had been particularly devoted to helping people understand their unique purpose in God's plan. As I read his biography, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was somehow orchestrating these events, reaching across the boundary of death to teach me something essential through my autistic nephew. One Saturday afternoon, something happened that took our experience to an entirely new level. Mateo was in the living room drawing while I sat nearby with my laptop, supposedly working but actually researching more about Carlo Acutis. Suddenly, Mateo set down his pencils and walked over to me, placing his small hand on my arm in that characteristic gentle way he'd developed. "Uncle Alessandro," he said, and even hearing him use my name was still shocking enough to make me catch my breath. "Carlo wants to tell you something important." I closed my laptop, giving him my full attention. Mateo's eyes, which usually avoided direct contact, locked onto mine with an intensity that was almost overwhelming. "He says you're going to write a computer program, but not the kind you make at work. This one is going to help other kids like me talk to their families. He says you already know how to do it. You just haven't thought about using your skills that way. And he says it's going to help more people than you can imagine. But you have to start soon because there are families who need it right now." The specificity of this message stunned me. I had actually been toying with an idea for assistive communication software designed specifically for autistic children, something that would adapt to each child's unique way of processing information. But I dismissed it as impractical, too ambitious, unlikely to make a real difference. I had mentioned this idea to absolutely no one, not even in my private notes, It had been just a passing thought during some late-night coding sessions. "Matteo?" I asked carefully. "Did Carlo tell you anything else about this program?" My nephew nodded seriously. "He said you should make it free for families who can't pay, and you should name it after someone you loved who died. He said that will help you heal the angry place in your heart, and it will make your friend Luca happy in heaven." That was the moment I stopped looking for rational explanations. I could have spent years trying to find psychological or neurological frameworks to explain how my nonverbal autistic nephew was accessing information he couldn't possibly know, delivering messages that addressed my deepest wounds and unexpressed ideas, all while attributing these communications to a deceased Italian teenager. Or I could simply accept what my nephew kept telling me, that Carlo Acutis was somehow reaching through the veil between life and death, using Matteo as a bridge, and calling me to something beyond my comfortable, controllable, purely material worldview. That evening, I began sketching out the basic architecture for what would become the Luca Communication System, a free assistive technology platform for autistic children. I worked late into the night, and for the first time since childhood, I felt like I was doing something that mattered beyond my paycheck or career advancement. I was responding to a call that came from somewhere beyond myself, and it felt like coming home to a part of my identity I'd forgotten existed. The next Sunday, in another first since my childhood, I went to Mass. I slipped into the back of a church near my apartment, feeling awkward and out of place among the regular attendees, who seemed to know all the prayers and responses I'd forgotten. But during the consecration, when the priest elevated the host, I remembered something I'd read about Carlo Acutis, that he had called the Eucharist my highway to heaven and had attended daily Mass from the time he received First Communion. As I knelt there in that crowded church, I felt something shift in my chest, like a door opening in a room I'd kept locked for decades. I didn't have a dramatic, mystical experience or see any visions, but I felt a quiet certainty settling over me, that God was real, that heaven was real, that my nephew was somehow in genuine communication with blessed souls on the other side, and that my life was meant for something more than I'd been living. After Mass, I stopped at the church bookstore and bought a small prayer card with Carlo Acutis' image and his most famous quote, "Everyone is born as an original, but many die as photocopies." As I tucked the card into my wallet, I made a quiet promise to Carlo and to God that I wouldn't die as a photocopy of who I was supposed to be. Over the following months, the extraordinary became our new normal, though that phrase feels inadequate to describe what continued unfolding in our family. Matteo's drawings evolved in both frequency and significance, and my own journey back to faith deepened in ways that surprised me daily. I had started attending daily Mass, driven initially by curiosity about Carlo's devotion to the Eucharist, but finding myself increasingly drawn to the peace and sense of purpose I experienced there. The Luca Communication System was taking shape faster than any project I'd ever worked on. I was coding late into the night, but instead of feeling drained, I felt energized by a sense of mission I'd never experienced in my corporate programming work. The software used machine learning to adapt to each child's unique communication patterns, creating personalized interfaces that met them where they were, rather than forcing them into standardized templates. I consulted with therapists, parents of autistic children, and autism advocates, incorporating their insights into increasingly sophisticated versions of the program. Matteo continued creating portraits that seemed to address specific needs in the lives of people who encountered them. My sister started a small Instagram account to share some of his work, and within weeks, we were receiving messages from families around the world asking if Matteo might draw something for their situations. A mother in Brazil, whose daughter had been in a coma, sent us a photo, and Matteo spontaneously created a portrait of the girl surrounded by light, with Carlo Acutis standing beside her bed. 2 weeks later, the mother messaged us in tears. Her daughter had woken up, and her first words had been about the boy with the computer who was in my room. We also began connecting with other families who had special needs children, experiencing what seemed to be mystical or spiritual gifts. A family in Ireland had a son with Down syndrome who could predict weather patterns with uncanny accuracy. A mother in Poland reported that her nonverbal daughter with cerebral palsy would sometimes speak in languages she'd never been exposed to, delivering messages of comfort to strangers in their native tongues. These stories, which I would have dismissed as delusion or exaggeration a year earlier, now resonated with our own impossible experiences. One particularly significant encounter happened at the hospital where Matteo had his regular therapy appointments. We were in the waiting room when a woman in her 60s sat down near us, visibly distressed, dabbing at tears she was trying to hide. Matteo, who normally avoided strangers, walked directly to her and placed his hand on her knee. "Don't be afraid about your son," he said clearly. "Carlo says he's going to be okay. The surgery will work, and you'll get to see him grow up to be a good man. But you have to stop blaming yourself for his sickness. It's not because you did anything wrong." The woman's face went absolutely white. She stared at Matteo in shock, then at my sister and me. "How could he possibly know?" she whispered. "I've never seen this child before. My son is in surgery right now for a brain tumor. I've been praying for hours, and I've been tormented by guilt, wondering if I'd somehow caused this by not catching the symptoms earlier, by not being a better mother." She couldn't continue, overcome by emotion. Matteo had already returned to his seat and was drawing on the small pad he now carried everywhere. When he finished, he brought the drawing to the woman. It showed a young boy, maybe 10 years old, smiling and healthy, playing soccer. "This is what he's going to look like when he's better," Matteo told her. "Carlo says to remember this picture when you're worried." 3 months later, we received a letter from that woman, Signora Benedetti. Her son had indeed survived the surgery and was making a remarkable recovery that had surprised his doctors. She enclosed a photo of him at his first soccer practice after being cleared for physical activity, and the resemblance to Matteo's drawing was unmistakable. These incidents began to happen with increasing frequency. Matteo's gift, because that's what I'd finally accepted it was, a genuine spiritual gift, seemed to be growing stronger and more specific. The medical professionals who worked with him were documenting these phenomena with a mixture of professional caution and personal amazement. Dr. Caruso, his developmental pediatrician, confessed to me one day, "In 25 years of practice, I've never seen anything like this. The improvements in Matteo's social engagement and communication are remarkable enough, but the consistent accuracy of information he couldn't possibly know through normal channels. Alessandro, I'm a scientist, but I'm also a human being who has to acknowledge when something transcends my framework for understanding." During this period, I also noticed a change in how I approached my own faith journey. It was no longer just about intellectual acceptance of doctrinal propositions or going through ritual motions. I found myself in genuine relationship with God, with Carlo as a kind of older brother figure who had reached back across death to guide me home. I started praying the rosary daily, something I'd last done as a child, and I felt Mary's presence in those prayers as a maternal reality rather than an abstract concept. One evening in late spring, Matteo created a drawing that shifted something fundamental in how I understood his gift and my role in all of this. He drew a complex scene showing multiple figures, Carlo Acutis at the center, holding a laptop that displayed an image of the Eucharist. Around him were various people of different ages, all reaching toward the screen. And in one corner, Matteo had drawn me, sitting at a computer but with light streaming from my hands toward the laptop Carlo was holding. "Carlo says your program is a gift from God," Matteo explained, "but not just to help kids talk to their families. He says it's going to help people see that kids like me aren't broken, We just see and hear things differently, and sometimes we see and hear heaven more clearly because our minds don't filter everything out like most people's minds do. Your program will help prove that being different isn't the same as being less. This message crystallized something I'd been sensing but hadn't fully articulated. That Mateo's autism wasn't simply a disorder to be overcome, but potentially a different configuration of consciousness that made him more permeable to spiritual realities most people couldn't access. The same neurological differences that made typical communication difficult for him might be precisely what allowed him to receive and transmit communications from Carlo and other blessed souls. I began incorporating this understanding into the Luca communication system, designing it not just to help special needs children communicate their basic wants and needs, but to capture and convey the unique perspectives and insights they might be experiencing. I added features that would let children express spiritual or mystical experiences without forcing them into conventional religious language that might not fit their actual experiences. The beta version of the program, launched in August, offered free to any family who wanted it, with a donation option for those who could afford to support its continued development. Within the first month, we had 3,000 families using it across 18 countries. The testimonials that started coming in were overwhelming. Parents describing breakthrough moments of connection with their children, therapists reporting improved outcomes, and most movingly, the children themselves using the program to share thoughts and experiences they'd never been able to express before. As autumn arrived, Mateo's communications from Carlo began to take on a more urgent and prophetic quality. The messages became less about individual comfort and more about larger patterns, about things that were coming, about preparations that needed to be made. It started with small, specific predictions that proved accurate. He told my sister that her colleague Francesca was pregnant before Francesca knew it herself, that there would be an unexpected opportunity for her husband Marco to change jobs, that I would receive a message from someone I hadn't heard from in many years. All of these predictions came to pass exactly as Mateo had described them, building a foundation of credibility that prepared us for larger revelations to come. The message from my past arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, an email from Luca's younger sister, whom I hadn't seen or spoken to since the funeral 23 years earlier. She had somehow come across an article about the Luca communication system and had been stunned to see that I'd named it after her brother. "Alessandro," she wrote, "I need to tell you something I've never shared with anyone. A few weeks before Luca died, he had a strange dream that he told me about. He said he dreamed that you were going to do something important with computers that would help children who couldn't speak, and that his name would be part of it. I was only 8 years old at the time, and I thought it was just a weird dream. But seeing your program now, I can't stop crying because he saw this coming all those years ago." I read that email at least 20 times, my hands shaking so hard I could barely hold my phone. The possibility that Luca had somehow foreseen this work, that his death and my subsequent anger at God were somehow part of a larger pattern that was only now becoming visible, shook me to my core. That evening, I showed the email to Matteo, and he nodded as if it confirmed something he already knew. "Carlo says Luca has been helping from heaven," Matteo told me. "He says sometimes people have to die young so they can help in bigger ways from the other side, like Carlo did." In early October, 2 years almost to the day from when Matteo had created his first drawing, he produced what would become his most significant prophetic work. He spent an entire day on a large format portrait showing Carlo Acutis in the center, but this time surrounded by a crowd of people, adults and children, faces from different eras and cultures, all looking towards something beyond the frame of the picture. At the bottom of the drawing, Matteo had written in his careful, newly developed handwriting, "Carlo says the church will honor him soon in a special way, and when they do, many people who stopped believing will start to believe again. He says you will be one of the people who helps tell his story to people who think God isn't real anymore. I studied this drawing carefully, trying to understand what the church will honor him in a special way might mean. Carlo had already been beatified in 2020. What further honor was coming? When I asked Matteo if he could be more specific, he simply shook his head. Carlo says you'll know when it happens, and you'll know what to do. During the same period, the Luca communication system was gaining recognition beyond what I'd ever imagined. Major autism advocacy organizations were endorsing it. Universities were incorporating it into their research on assistive technology, and we were receiving invitations to present at conferences around the world. But what moved me most were the personal stories. Families describing how the program had helped them discover that their children had profound thoughts, spiritual experiences, and insights that had been trapped inside minds that process communication differently. One mother sent us a video of her teenage son using the program to express, for the first time in his life, a detailed account of visions of saints he'd been experiencing since early childhood. Another family shared how their daughter, previously thought to have severe intellectual disability along with her autism, had used the program to compose poetry of surprising theological sophistication. These testimonies seemed to confirm what Matteo had been saying, that many people with neurological differences weren't less capable of spiritual experience, but potentially more attuned to spiritual realities. In late November, Matteo came to me with a message that was different from all the others, more personal, more difficult, more prophetic. We were alone in my apartment, where he now spent every Thursday evening while his parents had their weekly date night. He set down the drawing he'd been working on and looked at me with unusual seriousness. "Uncle Alessandro, Carlo has something important to tell you, but he says it might make you sad at first." I set aside my laptop and gave him my full attention. "Carlo says he's going to have to stop talking through me soon. Not forever, but for a while. He says his work with me is almost finished because I've learned what I needed to learn, and now he has other kids to help. But before he goes, he wants to make sure you understand something really important." My heart sank. Over the past 2 years, Carlo's presence in our lives through Matteo had become a source of constant guidance and comfort. The thought of losing that connection felt like preparing for another death, another goodbye to someone I'd come to love. "What does he want me to understand?" I managed to ask. Matteo picked up his drawing and handed it to me. It showed Carlo Acutis, but not as I'd seen him depicted before. In this image, he was wearing a white robe and standing in brilliant light, and instead of his characteristic smile, his expression was one of deep seriousness and authority. Around him were written several lines of text in Matteo's handwriting. "Tell them I was just a normal boy who fell in love with Jesus. Tell them they don't need to be special or perfect to be holy. They just need to say yes to God every day. Tell them the Eucharist is real, and that heaven is real, and that death is not the end but just a doorway to more life. Tell them I'm praying for them, especially the ones who think they're too broken or too bad or too ordinary to matter to God. And tell them that I'll keep helping from heaven until Jesus comes back, because that's what saints do. We work for the people we love until everyone gets home." I was crying by the time I finished reading it, overwhelmed by the beauty and simplicity of the message, by the responsibility it carried, by the love it conveyed. "Matteo," I said, pulling him into a hug that he tolerated with his characteristic patience for physical contact. "When is Carlo going to stop talking through you?" "Soon," Matteo said simply. "But it's okay, Uncle Alessandro. He taught me how to pray, and now I can talk to Jesus and Mary by myself. And he says you don't need him to talk through me anymore either because you remember how to pray now. He says his job was to bring you back to God, and it worked." That night, after taking Matteo home, I sat in my apartment with that final prophetic drawing, thinking about everything that had changed in 2 years. I had gone from being a comfortable agnostic to being a daily Mass attendee who prayed the Rosary and genuinely believed in the communion of saints. I had created a technology platform that was helping thousands of families discover the hidden depths of their special needs children. I had reconnected with Luca's memory in a way that brought healing instead of pain. And most importantly, I had found my way back to faith in a God who could use a 6-year-old autistic boy and a deceased Italian teenager to orchestrate miracles. I didn't know what Carlo meant about being honored in a special way, or when this prophetic communication would cease, or what my role would be in telling his story. But for the first time in my adult life, I was okay with not knowing, okay with trusting that the same God who had guided me this far would continue to guide me forward. The shift Matteo had predicted came exactly 3 weeks after he delivered Carlo's final message. It was mid-December, during what should have been an ordinary Thursday evening at my apartment. Matteo had been drawing quietly for about an hour when he suddenly set down his pencils, walked over to where I was working, and placed both hands on my shoulders, a level of initiated physical contact that was unprecedented even in his transformed state. "Uncle Alessandro," he said, his voice carrying a tone of finality that made my heart start racing. "Carlo says this is the last time he'll talk to you through me like this. He says he loves you like a brother, and he's proud of everything you've done with the program and with coming back to God. He says to watch for the sign he told you about, and when you see it, you'll know it's time to tell his story in a bigger way. And he says..." Matteo paused, his young face struggling with emotion in a way I'd never seen before. "He says to tell you that he and Luca are friends in heaven now, and they pray for you together every day." The tears started before I could stop them. The image of Carlo and Luca, 2 boys who had died young in different eras, becoming friends in heaven and praying together for me. It was more than my heart could hold. I pulled Matteo close, and for once he didn't pull away, but stood there accepting the embrace, his small body a channel for a love that reached across the boundary of death. "Is Carlo gone now?" I whispered. Matteo nodded against my shoulder. "But it's okay," he said with the simple faith of a child. "He's still in heaven. We can still pray to him. It's just not the same as when he talked through me." When Matteo pulled back, I could see that his eyes had changed somehow. Still his eyes, still showing the characteristic markers of his autism, but missing something of the otherworldly depth they'd carried for the past 2 years when he spoke for Carlo. Over the following weeks, Matteo's development continued, but in different directions. He was more verbal than before, his social engagement had permanently improved, but the prophetic drawings ceased. He still drew occasionally, and his work showed the technical skill he'd developed, but the portraits of saints stopped coming. When I asked if he still talked to Carlo, he nodded seriously. "In my prayers," he said, "like you do, but not the way it was before." The extraordinary chapter had closed, leaving us changed but returning Matteo more fully to his own experience of childhood. The Luca communication system continued to grow and impact families worldwide. By the end of that winter, we had 50,000 users across 42 countries, and the testimonials kept flooding in. Universities were studying the program's effectiveness. Autism advocacy groups were recommending it as a primary tool, and we'd received grant funding that allowed me to hire a small team of developers and expand the program's capabilities. But the most meaningful feedback came from the children themselves, using the program to share thoughts and experiences that revolutionized their families' understanding of who they were. I threw myself into work on both the program and on writing about our experiences, feeling that Carlo's instruction to tell his story meant documenting what had happened to our family. I started a blog called The Luca Project, where I shared about the development of the communication system, about Matteo's journey, and increasingly about Carlo Acutis and his continuing impact from heaven. The readership grew faster than the program itself, drawing people who were hungry for stories of authentic faith in a skeptical age. Spring came, then summer, then autumn again. I had settled into a rhythm of work, prayer, and family life that felt purposeful and meaningful in ways my previous existence never had. The program was succeeding beyond my wildest projections, and my blog was reaching hundreds of thousands of readers. But I hadn't forgotten Carlo's prophecy about being honored in a special way, and I watched Catholic news closely for any developments. The announcement came on a crisp morning in October, 3 years after Matteo's first drawing. I was having my morning coffee and checking news feeds when I saw the headline, "Vatican announces canonization of Blessed Carlo Acutis." My hands started shaking so badly I nearly dropped my phone. I read through the article in disbelief. Carlo Acutis would become Saint Carlo Acutis, the Catholic Church's first millennial saint, in a ceremony planned for the following spring. The announcement specifically highlighted his role as a patron for young people, for those who use technology to spread faith, and notably, for people with special needs and their families. This was the sign. This was the special honor Carlo had predicted through Matteo 3 years earlier. And I knew, with absolute certainty, what I was supposed to do. I opened my laptop and began writing what would become The Boy Who Drew Heaven, a full account of Matteo's transformation, Carlo's interventions, my journey back to faith, and the development of the Luca communication system. I wrote for 12 hours straight, barely stopping to eat, the words pouring out with an urgency I'd never experienced in any of my technical writing. When I finally finished the first draft, I sat back and reread what I'd written. It was raw and vulnerable, sharing details of my anger at God, my years of skepticism, my nephew's impossible gifts, and the way a dead teenager had orchestrated my return to faith. It was everything Carlo had asked me to share. That holiness wasn't about being perfect, but about saying yes to God. That heaven was real and actively engaged with earth. That death was a doorway rather than an ending. I published it on my blog that night, expecting it might resonate with my existing readers, but unprepared for what actually happened. Within 48 hours, the post had been shared over 1 million times across social media platforms. Major Catholic media outlets picked it up. Secular news sources started covering it as a human interest story about technology, autism, and faith. My email inbox exploded with messages from people all over the world, sharing their own experiences of Carlo's intercession, of special needs, children with spiritual gifts, of finding faith through unexpected channels. Television producers contacted me about documentary projects. Publishers offered book deals. Conference organizers invited me to speak at events around the world. But what moved me most were the personal messages from parents of special needs children who had felt isolated and hopeless until reading about Matteo and Carlo. "You've given me permission to believe that my daughter's differences might be gifts," one mother wrote. "I've been so focused on fixing her that I never considered God might have made her exactly as she is for a purpose I couldn't see." The canonization ceremony took place the following May in Rome, and my sister's family and I attended along with hundreds of thousands of other pilgrims who had come to witness the Church's formal recognition of Carlo's sanctity. As I knelt in St. Peter's Square, watching the proclamation that declared Carlo Acutis a saint, I thought about the journey that had brought me there, from angry skepticism to genuine faith, from seeing my nephew's autism as a tragedy to recognizing it as a different kind of gift, from creating technology for money to creating it for love. When the ceremony concluded and St. Carlo Acutis was officially added to the Church's calendar of saints, I felt a presence beside me, as real as the physical bodies of the pilgrims surrounding me in the square. Not a vision or a voice, just a sense of someone standing there, someone young and joyful, someone who had kept his promise to pray for me until I got home. I didn't need to turn to look. I knew who it was. 4 years have passed since Matteo created his first impossible drawing of the Virgin Mary, and the transformation that began that December morning has rippled outward in ways that continue to astonish me. What started as one autistic boy's inexplicable artistic gift has evolved into a global movement recognizing the spiritual gifts of people with developmental differences, fundamentally changing how thousands of families and professionals understand the intersection of disability and holiness. Matteo is now 10 years old, and while he remains autistic, still struggling with certain social cues, still needing routine and predictability, still processing the world through his unique neurological lens, he has developed into an articulate, thoughtful child whose insights about faith and life regularly surprise the adults around him. He no longer receives the prophetic communications that characterized those extraordinary 2 years, but he maintains an active prayer life and a special devotion to St. Carlo Acutis that informs his daily choices. The most remarkable development has been watching Matteo step into his own understanding of his experiences and his purpose. Last year, he asked if he could write his own account of what happened, using the Luca communication system to help organize his thoughts. The result was a simple but profound document called When Carlo Talked to Me, which my sister published with his permission. In it, Matteo describes his experience of autism not as a disorder but as a different way of perceiving reality, one that, in his case, made him more receptive to spiritual communication than typical consciousness allows. Most people's brains have a lot of filters that block out extra information, Matteo wrote, but my brain doesn't have all those filters. That's why loud noises bother me and why I see patterns other people miss. But it's also why I could hear Carlo when he talked to me from heaven. My autism wasn't a mistake. It was the exact thing God used to let Carlo reach my family and help Uncle Alessandro find his way back home. This perspective has revolutionized how many families and professionals approach autism and other developmental differences. The Luca communication system, now used by over 200,000 families in 67 countries, has become a platform not just for basic communication, but for documenting and sharing the unique spiritual insights of special needs individuals. We've created a secure database of testimonies from children and adults using the system who report mystical experiences, prophetic knowledge, or other phenomena that suggest heightened spiritual sensitivity. The research emerging from this database is challenging conventional assumptions about the relationship between neurological difference and spiritual capacity. Dr. Isabella Marchetti, a neuropsychologist who joined our research team 2 years ago, has published several papers suggesting that certain neurological configurations associated with autism, Down syndrome, and other conditions may correlate with increased capacity for what she carefully terms anomalous information acquisition, knowing things without normal sensory input. We're not claiming that developmental differences are better than typical neurology, Dr. Marchetti explained in her most recent publication. But we are accumulating evidence that different neurological organizations may provide access to different kinds of information and experience. The materialist assumption that consciousness is wholly contained within and produced by the brain may need significant revision in light of this data. My own life has been completely reconfigured around the mission that emerged from Matteo's gift. I left my corporate position 3 years ago to work full-time on the Luca project, which now encompasses the communication system, a research foundation, and a global network of families supporting one another in recognizing and nurturing spiritual gifts in special needs individuals. The book I wrote, The Boy Who Drew Heaven, has been translated into 32 languages and has become a touchstone for families navigating the intersection of faith and disability. I've spoken at hundreds of conferences and events, sharing our family's story and advocating for a perspective that sees developmental differences not merely as deficits to be remedied, but as potentially unique configurations that serve purposes we don't fully understand. The response has been overwhelming. not just from Catholic audiences, but from people across diverse faith traditions who recognize something universal in Matteo's experience of accessing spiritual reality through his different way of being in the world. But perhaps the most profound ongoing impact has been personal. I'm now married to Sophia, my colleague who met Matteo 4 years ago during her divorce and received that drawing of Saint Monica. Our relationship grew out of our shared experience of having our lives transformed by an autistic boy's impossible gift and a teenage saint's persistent intercession. We have a daughter now, Elena, named after the woman Matteo met in the hospital who received the drawing of her deceased child. Elena is neurotypical, healthy, and developing normally, but Sophia and I have committed to raising her with an understanding that different doesn't mean less, that disability doesn't mean inability, and that God's gifts come in forms we often don't expect. My relationship with my sister's family has deepened into something sacred. Julia and Marco have become advocates in their own right, speaking at parent support groups and training sessions for therapists and educators about seeing beyond disability to recognize potential gifts. They've created a foundation that provides support for families who believe their special needs. Children may be experiencing spiritual phenomena, but feel isolated or afraid to speak about it publicly. Most importantly, my faith has become the organizing center of my life in ways that would have been unimaginable during my years of skepticism. I attend daily Mass, pray the Rosary, and maintain a personal relationship with St. Carlo Acutis that feels as real as my relationships with living friends. I pray to him constantly for guidance in my work, for families using the Luca system, for children who are struggling to communicate, for parents who are exhausted and losing hope. And I consistently experience what can only be called answers to those prayers. Not usually in dramatic ways, no more prophetic drawings or supernatural knowledge, but in the quieter miracles of doors opening at exactly the right time, of connections being made that advance our mission, of words coming to mind that help someone who's struggling. Carlo's promise that he would keep helping from heaven until everyone gets home has proven absolutely true in my experience. The Luca communication system continues to evolve and expand. We've added features specifically designed to help children express spiritual experiences and insights, creating frameworks that don't force supernatural experiences into narrow religious categories, but allow each child to describe their encounters in their own terms. The results have been extraordinary. Children describing visions of deceased relatives, knowledge of future events, experiences of divine presence, and encounters with what they identify as angels or saints. We're careful in how we document and present this information, working with theologians, psychologists, and medical professionals to maintain credibility while honoring the authenticity of these children's experiences. Some cases are easier to verify than others. When a child accurately describes a deceased person they never met or predicts an event that subsequently occurs exactly as described, the evidence is more compelling. Other experiences are more subjective, but no less transformative for the individuals and families involved. What unites all these testimonies is a common thread: that people with developmental differences, far from being spiritually impaired, may have privileged access to spiritual realities that those of us with typical neurology often miss. They remind us that human consciousness is more mysterious and multifaceted than our materialist age wants to acknowledge, and that God's ways of communicating with humanity are far more diverse than our narrow assumptions allow. If you've stayed with me through this entire testimony, if your heart has been touched by Matteo's story and Carlo's persistent love reaching across death to transform lives, I want to invite you to do something specific right now. First, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because I regularly share updates about the Luca Project, about families whose lives have been transformed by recognizing the spiritual gifts in their special needs children. and about ongoing signs of St. Carlo's intercession in our world. Second, I want you to consider someone in your life who has developmental differences. Maybe a family member, maybe a neighbor, maybe a student or client you work with professionally. Instead of seeing them primarily through the lens of their limitations or diagnoses, ask yourself, what if God has given this person unique gifts that I've been missing because I've been looking for typical markers of intelligence and capability? What if their different way of experiencing the world gives them access to truths and realities that my filtered, conventional consciousness screens out? Third, I invite you to pray to St. Carlo Acutis, especially if you have someone in your life with special needs, or if you're struggling to believe that God is real and active in our world. You can use this simple prayer that we've found meaningful. St. Carlo, you understood what it means to be different, to see the world in your own unique way, and to use your particular gifts for God's glory. Help me recognize the gifts in people I've been seeing only as limited or broken. Help me believe that heaven is real and that God speaks to us in ways more diverse than I've imagined. And if it's God's will, let me experience some sign of your presence and intercession. Amen. Finally, share this testimony with someone who needs to hear it. Maybe you know a parent who's exhausted from caring for a special needs child and who needs to hear that their child might carry gifts they haven't recognized. Maybe you know someone who's lost their faith and needs to hear that God pursues us through unexpected channels. Maybe you know an educator or therapist who works with special needs individuals and who could benefit from expanding their understanding of what these children and adults might be experiencing. Drop a comment below telling me your own story. Have you witnessed something in a person with developmental differences that seem to go beyond their diagnosis? Have you experienced St. Carlo's intercession in your life? Are you caring for someone with special needs and struggling to see hope in the situation? Your testimony might be exactly what another person needs to hear to keep going, to start believing, or to recognize the miracle that's been in front of them all along. Remember what Matteo wrote in his own account. His autism wasn't a mistake, but the exact thing God used to reach our family. Whatever differences or difficulties you're facing in your life or in the lives of people you love, consider the possibility that God might be present in those very challenges in ways you haven't yet recognized. The same God who spoke through a non-verbal autistic boy and worked through a teenage saint who died almost 2 decades ago is still speaking, still working, still reaching across every boundary we think separates heaven from earth. May St. Carlo Acutis continue to intercede for all families touched by developmental differences, helping us see that what the world calls disability might sometimes be a different kind of ability, the ability to perceive and communicate realities that typical consciousness filters out, the ability to remind us that we're surrounded by mystery and miracle, the ability to call us back to wonder and faith and the recognition that we're never alone.